The moment she shouted that she was calling 911, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal evening, and something told me that if I stayed calm, the truth would eventually speak louder than her voice. I had just pulled into my own driveway after a long day, my engine still ticking as it cooled, when a woman marched across the sidewalk, phone already in her hand, eyes locked on me like I had committed a crime in broad daylight. Without hesitation, she announced to anyone listening that I was trespassing, acting suspicious, and refusing to leave her property. What she didn't know was that I was the police chief. Earlier that afternoon, construction crews had partially blocked our street, forcing temporary driveway sharing. Notices were delivered. Signs were posted. Everything was clearly explained. I followed the instructions exactly. None of that mattered to her. In her mind, I didn't belong there. I tried to speak calmly, even pointed toward the notice on her mailbox, but she cut me off, turned her back, and began describing me to the dispatcher as if I were a dangerous stranger. Neighbors started watching. Curtains shifted. A phone camera appeared across the street. The air felt heavy, like the entire block was holding its breath. She paced in front of me, confident and loud, repeating that the police would handle this. Each time she said it, she smiled a little wider, certain she was in control. I stood beside my car, hands visible, saying nothing. I had learned long ago that interrupting a lie only gives it more energy. I could have ended it right there by identifying myself, but I chose not to. Authority means nothing if it only exists to protect you when it's convenient. Then I heard sirens. Her posture changed instantly. She crossed her arms, lifted her chin, and looked at me like the verdict had already been delivered. The patrol cars turned onto the street, lights flashing, neighbors stepping closer to see what would happen next. I adjusted my jacket, took a slow breath, and waited. She had no idea that the call she made so confidently was about to flip everything upside down. Within minutes, her certainty would collapse, her story would unravel, and a simple driveway argument would become a lesson in assumptions, accountability, and how quickly power disappears when it collides with the truth, right in front of everyone watching. The patrol cars rolled to a stop, red and blue lights washing over the houses like a sudden storm, and the street fell silent. 2 officers stepped out, their movements calm and deliberate, eyes scanning the scene the way only experience teaches you to do. Before either of them could speak to me, the woman rushed forward, phone still in her hand, voice rising as she launched into her version of events. She pointed at me sharply and said I had parked illegally, refused to leave, and made her feel unsafe. Her words came fast, confident, rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She kept glancing at me with a look that said she was sure the system was about to work in her favor. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed, face neutral, letting her talk. One of the officers, Officer Ramirez, nodded politely as he listened, while the other, Officer Cole, took in the surroundings. Their eyes moved from the driveway to the mailbox, then back to me. They asked her a few clarifying questions, and each answer added a new detail that hadn't existed before. The story was already changing. Then Officer Ramirez looked directly at me. At first, it was just a longer glance than usual. Then his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. His posture straightened, and his steps slowed. "Sir," he said carefully, "can I get your name?" I gave it to him without hesitation. For a moment, he didn't respond. He looked at Officer Cole, then back at me again, like his brain was catching up to what his eyes already recognized. "Chief," he asked quietly. The word seemed to suck the air out of the street. Officer Cole turned sharply, eyes widening as recognition hit him too. The woman laughed nervously and shook her head, insisting they were mistaken. She said I was lying, that people pretend to be police all the time. Her confidence wavered, just slightly. Officer Ramirez radioed dispatch to confirm my identity. The response came back almost immediately, clear and undeniable. My name. My position. My address. Each detail landed like a weight. The woman's face drained of color, and her phone lowered halfway, frozen in her hand. Officer Cole asked her to explain the situation again, this time slowly. She tried, but the details no longer lined up. Ramirez walked over and pulled the construction notice from the mailbox, reading it aloud. Temporary access. Shared driveways. Exactly as I had said. Neighbors murmured. One spoke up, confirming I had stayed calm the entire time. Another nodded in agreement. The balance of power shifted completely, and for the first time, she realized the call she made wasn't going the way she had planned at all. The moment Officer Ramirez finished reading the construction notice aloud, the woman's confidence finally cracked. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped, as if realizing every word she said from this point forward could make things worse. The silence felt louder than her earlier shouting. Neighbors leaned in slightly, sensing the shift. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was unraveling. Officer Cole asked her a simple question: why had she told the dispatcher that I was aggressive and refusing to leave? She blinked, then said she felt scared. When asked what exactly I had done to frighten her, she couldn't answer clearly. Her explanation changed mid-sentence, circling back on itself. Fear turned into frustration, and frustration into panic. Ramirez calmly explained that 911 calls are recorded and documented. He reminded her that exaggerating or fabricating details isn't harmless. Those details shape how officers respond. They affect safety. They affect outcomes. As he spoke, Cole walked back to the patrol car and returned with a small device. The dispatcher's voice crackled softly as the recording of the call began to play. Her own words echoed across the driveway. She had described me as threatening. She had claimed I refused to move. She had insisted I was trespassing. Each sentence hung in the air, undeniable and clear. A neighbor shook his head slowly. Another crossed their arms. The woman stared at the ground, her phone now completely lowered. She tried one last time to explain it away, saying she was emotional and didn't mean it like that. Ramirez nodded, acknowledging her feelings, but his tone remained firm. Intent matters, he said, but accuracy matters more. Emergency services exist for real danger, not personal disputes fueled by assumptions. He informed her she would be cited for misuse of emergency services and filing a false report. He explained the process carefully, step by step. Citation. Documentation. Court appearance. This wasn't a warning. This was accountability. Her shoulders sagged as the weight of it hit her. The confident posture she'd held earlier was gone. She asked if this could be handled another way. Ramirez answered honestly. No. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with a familiar sense of disappointment. I'd seen this too many times in my career. People assume the system will side with them automatically. They don't expect the truth to push back. As paperwork was completed, a neighbor spoke up again, confirming I had remained calm from the start. Others nodded. No one defended her story anymore. It no longer needed debating. When the citation was handed to her, she stared at it for a long moment before turning and walking slowly back toward her house. The patrol car lights dimmed. The crowd began to disperse. But I knew this moment wasn't over. The consequences of that call were only beginning to follow her beyond this driveway, into places she never expected. When the patrol cars finally pulled away, the street felt unnaturally quiet, as if the noise had been replaced by reflection. The flashing lights disappeared around the corner, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Neighbors slowly drifted back into their homes, some shaking their heads, others whispering behind partially closed doors. A moment that started with shouting had ended in silence, and that silence felt heavy. I stood alone in my driveway for a few seconds longer than necessary. This was home, the one place where the uniform was supposed to stay invisible, where life slowed down. Instead, it had turned into a public lesson on how quickly assumptions can spiral into serious consequences. I had faced dangerous situations before, but this one felt different because it was personal, exposed, and unnecessary. Across the street, her house went dark. The porch light clicked off. Curtains closed. There was no apology, no attempt to speak. I didn't expect one. Embarrassment has a way of making people disappear. Still, silence doesn't undo actions. It only gives them space to echo in your thoughts. Inside my house, I placed my keys on the counter and finally let out a deep breath. My phone vibrated almost immediately. Messages from officers, supervisors, and a few friends who had already heard pieces of the story. I replied to each briefly, repeating the same thing every time. Everything was handled by the book. No special treatment. No exceptions. That mattered more than comfort. Later that night, I stepped back outside to check the mailbox. The construction notice was still taped there, edges curling slightly in the evening air. I stared at it longer than I should have. A simple piece of paper. Clear instructions. All of it ignored in favor of emotion and entitlement. It reminded me how often conflict starts not from facts, but from assumptions people never bother to question. As I replayed the evening, I realized how easily it could have gone wrong. A raised voice. A defensive movement. A different officer responding with incomplete information. The line between calm resolution and chaos is thinner than most people realize. That's why accuracy matters. That's why restraint matters. I had spent years warning people about misuse of emergency services. That night turned theory into reality. A false 911 call doesn't just waste time. It diverts resources, escalates situations, and puts lives at risk. And once it's made, it can't be taken back. Before heading inside for the night, I looked down the street one last time. Everything appeared normal again. Quiet. Ordinary. But I knew better. That driveway had become a reminder that accountability doesn't arrive gently. It arrives when truth is tested, and it leaves lessons behind that don't fade quickly. By the next morning, the incident had already begun to ripple through the neighborhood. Not loudly, not online, but quietly, the way uncomfortable truths usually travel. A few neighbors nodded at me differently than before. Conversations paused when I walked past. Everyone knew something had happened, and everyone had their own version of it. I knew it wouldn't stay a private driveway story for long. At headquarters, I made a deliberate choice. I requested a formal internal review of the incident. Some might think that was unnecessary, but to me, it was non-negotiable. If the system is going to mean anything, it has to apply equally, especially when leadership is involved. Body camera footage, dispatch recordings, witness statements, and documentation about the construction notice were all pulled and reviewed. The findings were straightforward. The officers followed procedure. The call was unfounded. The response was appropriate. No lines were crossed, and no favors were given. That mattered more than clearing my own name. Trust in law enforcement isn't built on authority. It's built on consistency. For her, however, the situation was becoming very real. The citation she received wasn't just a fine or a warning. It came with a court date. The recorded 911 call left little room for reinterpretation. Words spoken in anger don't disappear once regret sets in. They stay documented, replayed, and weighed carefully. That afternoon, a small envelope appeared in my office mailbox. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. Short. Careful. She admitted she had overreacted. She wrote that she had felt embarrassed, overwhelmed, and scared by how quickly everything escalated. She said she never imagined things would go that far. Most people don't. That's often why they do. I folded the note and placed it in my desk drawer. Apologies don't erase consequences, but they matter. They show awareness. Whether that awareness would lead to real change wasn't something I could control. What surprised me most were the small shifts that followed. Neighbors became more willing to talk things out directly. Officers noticed fewer unnecessary calls from the area. A single moment, handled properly, had quietly changed behavior. That's what accountability looks like when it's visible. It doesn't humiliate. It corrects. I didn't feel satisfied. Consequences aren't about winning. They're about preventing the next false call, the next escalation, the next situation that didn't need to exist. That driveway argument was never really about parking. It was about power, perception, and what happens when someone assumes the system exists to serve their emotions. As the day ended, I realized the lesson wasn't over. It was still unfolding, slowly, in conversations, in decisions, in moments where people paused before picking up a phone. And sometimes, that pause is the most important outcome of all. By the end of that week, I realized that staying silent wasn't the responsible choice. When incidents like this aren't addressed, they don't disappear, they mutate. Rumors grow sharper than facts, and people fill in gaps with assumptions. As police chief, I owed the community clarity, not secrecy. So I decided to speak, not to defend myself, but to protect trust in the process. At a previously scheduled community meeting, I stood in front of a room filled with neighbors, business owners, and local residents. Some faces were curious, some uncomfortable, some already convinced they knew what had happened. I didn't use notes. I didn't dramatize anything. I simply told the story exactly as it unfolded, from the construction notice to the 911 call and its outcome. I explained why misuse of emergency services is dangerous. How every false call diverts officers from real emergencies. How exaggerated claims change the way responders approach a scene. I reminded them that words spoken to dispatch don't stay private, they become part of a permanent record that carries real consequences. The room was silent, not with tension, but with attention. Then I addressed the question no one had asked out loud. I confirmed that Internal Affairs had reviewed the incident in full. Body cameras. Dispatch audio. Witness statements. Everything. I made it clear that my actions were examined the same way anyone else's would be. Accountability, I said, only works if leadership submits to it first. I could feel the mood shift. People relaxed. A few nodded. Trust doesn't rebuild instantly, but transparency helps it breathe again. After the meeting, residents approached me quietly. One admitted they'd almost called the police during a neighbor dispute and decided to talk instead. Another thanked me for staying calm that night. Those conversations mattered more than any applause ever could. They meant the lesson had landed where it needed to. The woman wasn't present, but later that evening, her attorney contacted the department to confirm she would comply fully with the court process. No excuses. No counterclaims. Just acceptance. That told me more than anger ever would. Over the next few days, the effects became visible in subtle ways. Officers reported fewer unnecessary calls. Neighbors communicated more directly. The system worked better because people respected it. That night in my driveway reinforced something I've learned over decades. Power can force outcomes, but fairness prevents repeat mistakes. Leadership isn't proven when things are easy. It's proven when emotions run high and restraint still wins. Sometimes, the most important lessons aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones that quietly change how people choose to act the next time conflict shows up at their door. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of that night never fully disappeared. It showed up in small, unexpected ways. Officers spoke more carefully during briefings. Neighbors paused longer before reacting. Disputes that might once have turned into phone calls were handled face to face instead. What happened in my driveway had quietly changed how people thought about conflict and authority. Then one afternoon, I ran into her. It was at a local grocery store, the kind of ordinary place where no one expects difficult conversations. I was grabbing a basket when I felt that familiar hesitation, the sense that someone nearby was debating whether to speak or walk away. I turned and saw her standing a few steps back, frozen. She looked different. The sharp confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty and discomfort. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could have walked past her without a word. Professionally and personally, I didn't owe her anything. But leadership doesn't stop when it becomes uncomfortable. Sometimes it matters most in quiet moments no one else will ever see. I gave a small nod. That was enough. She apologized. Not quickly, not defensively, but carefully, as if choosing each word mattered. She said she had replayed that night again and again, realizing how fear and assumptions had taken control. She admitted embarrassment, not just over the citation, but over how publicly wrong she had been. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop talking. She needed to say it. I listened without interrupting. I didn't minimize what happened, and I didn't shame her either. I told her that apologies matter, but accountability matters more. I reminded her that false accusations don't just affect one person. They strain systems, create risk, and leave lasting consequences that aren't always visible on paper. She nodded, eyes down, understanding finally settling in. We didn't shake hands. We didn't offer forgiveness or closure wrapped neatly in words. We simply acknowledged the moment for what it was, then went our separate ways. Sometimes, that's all resolution needs to be. Driving home, I thought about how consequences extend far beyond fines or court dates. They live in awkward encounters, quiet reflection, and the slow rebuilding of trust. That's where real change happens, not under flashing lights, but in moments of personal discomfort. Not everyone who misuses authority reflects afterward. Many double down. But when reflection does happen, it deserves space to work. That encounter reminded me why restraint matters more than humiliation, and why dignity, even when undeserved, can sometimes open the door to growth. That driveway incident was never about winning or losing. It was about truth meeting power and showing which one actually holds weight. And sometimes, the most meaningful outcomes happen long after the noise is gone, when accountability finally has room to take root. After that encounter, I found myself thinking differently about the badge I carried every day. For many people, a badge represents power, authority, or even fear. For me, that night and everything that followed reshaped its meaning into something heavier and more personal. It wasn't about control. It was about responsibility, restraint, and the obligation to act with fairness even when emotions run high. I began sharing the story quietly during training sessions, carefully removing names and locations. I didn't tell it for drama. I told it because it showed how quickly situations can escalate when assumptions replace facts. I explained how officers rely on accurate information to stay safe, how a single exaggerated claim can change the entire tone of a response, and how professionalism is tested most when someone is lying about you. The room would always grow quiet at that point. Recruits understood this wasn't theory pulled from a manual. It was real life. I reminded them that wearing a badge doesn't give you the right to win every situation. It gives you the responsibility to slow things down when others are speeding up. Outside of work, I noticed changes in myself too. I listened longer. I explained more. I reminded myself that fear often speaks louder than logic for people who don't understand the system. That doesn't excuse misuse of emergency services, but it explains why patience matters. Trust isn't built by force. It's built by consistency. One evening, weeks later, I stood in the same driveway watching kids ride bikes and neighbors talk casually. The street looked peaceful again, almost like nothing had ever happened. But I knew how fragile that peace was. One emotional decision. One impulsive phone call. That's all it takes to fracture it. The badge doesn't make someone right. The law doesn't exist to validate feelings. Truth is what keeps situations grounded. That night proved that when the system works as intended, it protects everyone, even when the outcome is uncomfortable. I never shared this story to shame anyone. I shared it to remind people that authority is not a shortcut to being correct. It's a commitment to be careful, honest, and fair. Abuse it, and the system pushes back. Respect it, and it serves everyone equally. That woman tried to use the police as leverage in a personal conflict. Instead, the moment became a mirror, reflecting character, accountability, and consequence. Not loudly. Not violently. Just clearly. Standing there long after the noise had faded, I understood something deeply. Titles change. Uniforms come and go. But how you handle the truth when it challenges you stays with you. And that, more than any rank or badge, is what leadership is really measured by, every single day. Looking back now, I understand why that night in my driveway stayed with me longer than most moments in my career. It wasn't dramatic in the way people expect. There were no arrests, no shouting matches caught on viral video, no instant justice served with applause. Instead, it revealed something far more important about power, truth, and the choices people make when emotions take control. The driveway itself never mattered. It was just concrete. What mattered was the belief that authority could be summoned like a weapon, that a phone call could replace facts, and that confidence alone could bend the system. That belief collapsed the moment truth entered the scene. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just steadily, piece by piece. I still park in that same spot every night. Every time I do, I'm reminded that leadership isn't proven in offices, titles, or meetings. It's proven in moments when you're falsely accused and choose patience anyway. When you could end a situation instantly, but instead allow the process to work as it should. That restraint matters more than rank ever will. The officers who responded that night did exactly what they were trained to do. They listened carefully. They verified facts. They followed procedure without bias or shortcuts. That consistency is what separates justice from chaos. When people see the system applied evenly, even uncomfortable outcomes become easier to accept. For anyone hearing this story, here's what matters most. Before you reach for authority, reach for understanding. Before you call for power, ask yourself whether you're prepared to face the consequences if you're wrong. Emergency services are not customer support. They are a lifeline. Misusing them doesn't just affect one person standing in front of you. It affects everyone who might need help while resources are tied up elsewhere. That woman didn't face consequences because of who I was. She faced consequences because her story couldn't stand up to the truth. Titles fade. Uniforms change. But facts remain. Truth doesn't rush. It doesn't argue. It waits. I didn't share this story for praise or sympathy. I shared it as a reminder that accountability isn't punishment. It's correction. It's how systems stay strong and communities stay safe. When honesty leads, power follows the right path. That night could have gone very differently. It could have escalated. Someone could have been hurt. Instead, it became a lesson visible to everyone watching, including me. A lesson about restraint, humility, and the quiet strength of letting truth speak for itself. If this story stays with you, let it be for that reason. Not the meltdown. Not the shock. But the reminder that truth doesn't need volume to win. It only needs time. And in the end, time always exposes what power alone never can.